It is the voice of Indiana County, WCCS AM 1160, 101.1 FM. There are many, many memorable moments for folks when they consider World War II history, and the 75th anniversary of D-Day has to be one of the most momentous. And Alex Kershaw is with us. He is the author of The First Wave, the D-Day Warriors Who Led the Way to Victory in World War II. Let's say good morning. What a wonderful, wonderful book this is. Good morning to you.
Good morning. How are you?
Well, I'm just lovely, and it's great to have you on the air with us today, because I don't think there's anybody out there who is more qualified to talk about D-Day than you. You spend a lot of time on the beach at Normandy, don't you?
Yeah, I was there about a week ago with 30 Americans from the World War II Museum. I lead battlefield tours of Normandy for the museum. So yeah, I've been there many times. First time I went was 25 years ago, and it still moves me to tears. It still profoundly affects me.
Well, that was what I was going to ask you, because especially as you have written this book, The First Wave, about the people who came to shore on the beaches at Normandy, does it still affect you as it once did?
Yeah, it does. It does, because I've, over the years, I've interviewed and got to know several dozen veterans from the Battle of Normandy, and I interviewed the widows. I've interviewed the relatives of men who died there, who gave their lives there. So I think as I get older, I'm into my 50s now, I become more mature and reflective, and I realize just what that sacrifice meant, how much it hurt, how much it brought, how much it affected my life. I mean, I'm a European. I grew up in peace and prosperity in Europe because of what was done on D-Day. So, yeah, I don't think there's a day of the 20th century that meant more to world history, or actually has meant more to me, individually.
Generally, books of your type sort of live in your mind for a few years before you ever get around to actually putting things down into the computer. No longer putting them down on paper, you're putting them down into the computer. But as you considered how you would direct this book, The First Wave, and the very many missions that are covered and the various aspects of it, how did you narrow down what has to have been thousands of stories that you've heard down through the years?
A very good question. I decided that I basically was going to be unashamed about this. I was going to say, here are the superstars. Here are the guys that had the toughest jobs, pulled off the most difficult missions, were most likely to die, who gave the most, and I'm going to celebrate the hell out of them. And some of them you may have heard about a little bit before, some of them you may have come across tangentially, but I'm going to pick these 10 guys and I'm going to turn them into the superstars they were and show exactly what it took, almost second by second, to get the job done, and celebrate them unashamedly, because they were awesome. They were extraordinary human beings.
Yeah, it's interesting, because in my latest Bible reading, I'm just going over the section of David's Mighty Warriors, and it reminded me, I'm reading your book simultaneously with that. These fellows would have fit right in that particular story. I'm really interested in a couple of them whose stories just, I guess, hit me in a way that was really fascinating to me. Lieutenant John Spaulding and then his Sergeant Phil Stresick. Tell me about them.
Yeah, well, you've got two of the ultimate warriors there. I don't think you could find, you could randomly select very brave men on D-Day, but both those guys epitomize guts and courage and initiative. Lieutenant John Spaulding had never seen combat before, and he led the first platoon, the first American unit off Omaha Beach. He landed around 6:30 a.m. and for around an hour and a half fought through utter unimaginable hell and led the very first Americans off that beach. And the significance of that is that what he did, others had to do too, and others like him also led men off that killing zone. But he was the first. He was the first American officer to succeed on Omaha Beach on D-Day. And he said that, we had an angel on each shoulder. And after he'd survived the first wave on D-Day, he felt immortal. I mean, he said, if you can live through what I lived through, I felt that God had a purpose for me. I was put on the earth to be a combat leader. And he survived the war and was very much affected by it, very much traumatized by the combat that he survived, had severe PTSD, as did Phil Strezek. And it's a downer, I'm sorry to say this, but Spaulding was shot by his wife after an argument and died in his late 40s, shot close to the heart and killed by his own wife. And then Strezek, because of the trauma that he too had endured, the cost of liberating Europe, of liberating those millions, he committed suicide. He was so affected by what he'd gone through. So people paid a very, very, very high price indeed on D-Day. Over 2,500 Americans killed on D-Day, 900 on Omaha Beach. But they paid a price later after they came home too, because they'd gone through enormous trauma.
And in today's day and age, when there is so much more attention paid to the issues of PTSD than there were in that day, it's pretty instructive for us in modern times to consider that this has always been a problem. And it sort of helps us to understand, if not as intimately because we're not as involved in it, certainly that these fellows are going through things that we really can't imagine. And you tell those stories over and over and over again. I love the story of Bill Millen with bagpipes.
Yeah. I think anybody that's seen The Longest Day, the movie, would recognize Bill Millen. He's the only man out of over 170,000 on D-Day that was actually playing the bagpipes. It was not allowed. The British Army, who was under Lord Lovat in the British Commandos, and the British had passed a law, or rather they'd said that you couldn't play the bagpipes because in the First World War it attracted enemy fire, So it was not a good idea to start playing the pipes because you'd get shelled or bombed. But anyway, Lord Lovat, who was a Scottish aristocrat, said, well, that's the British. I'm Scottish. Who cares what they say? You're going to play the pipes. And unbelievably, Bill Millen played the pipes from around about 7 o'clock in the morning right through to the late afternoon of D-Day, marching across the beach 3 or 4 times, playing several very, very stirring tunes, and survived the war. And we would go back to Pegasus Bridge and the beach where he landed for decades after the war. He was the only guy playing the pipes on D-Day. Mm-hmm.
Now, you start your book with Eisenhower making the decision to actually go on D-Day, the day that 75 years ago we commemorate now as the beginning of the Allied invasion of the European continent. Eisenhower makes that decision with a very small window of when the weather would actually allow it to happen. But because that weather calmed down doesn't mean that it was an ideal condition for the invasion. Talk about how the channel itself is actually a character in your book, isn't it?
Yeah, no, I mean, I had a guy called Leonard Schroeder, F Company, officially the first American to wade ashore on D-Day. He came in at 6:28 a.m. on Utah Beach. And that's a big deal. He was in the newspapers. He came from Maryland and University of Maryland athlete, and the newspapers all across America in the middle of June declared him to be officially the first American to put his boots on French sand and then soil. But the point is that when he was interviewed long after the war, he said that 4 out of 5 guys in his landing craft as he came in towards Normandy were puking up. I mean, it was sick. That's 4 out of 5 guys who were seriously seasick because the weather was still bad. There were white-capped seas everywhere, and they were bursting through 6 foot of surf when they came ashore. They were being tossed around like corks in some cases. It was there were the conditions were bad, and the men in those landing craft were bouncing up and down and were very, very sick. A lot of them were just pleased to get out of the boat. They, machine gun fires popping over their heads, and there's people being killed all around them. But a lot of them, after the war, when they were interviewed, said, "I was just relieved to have my feet on terra firma, just anything but being in that boat. That was, who cares?"
Alex Kershaw is with us. The book is The First Wave, the D-Day Warriors Who Led the Way to Victory in World War II. Of course, we're talking about the landings on the beaches of Normandy, but the night before, there was plenty of action as well in the skies and on the ground well beyond the beaches. And you mentioned Pegasus Bridge. The paratroopers, the glider riders, and the pilots of the gliders, they have an entirely different and just as frightening encounter, don't they, on the night before the landings on the beaches of Normandy?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you'd be hard-pressed to find a more suicidal job than a glider pilot on D-Day, landing in darkness in the early hours of June the 6th, 1944. These guys were being set free from planes that towed them across the English Channel at around about 6,000 feet. And then without radar, without modern technology, often just using a stopwatch and a compass, they crash-landed. I mean, you're in a wooden glider, and you are crash-landing at 90 to 100 miles per hour into enemy-held territory. It was, I mean, anybody would have to say that is a pretty crazy, suicidal thing to do. And they knew it, and we had high casualties, not as much as we expected. We expected around 80% of those guys to be killed or wounded, but we suffered a lot of casualties because it was a very, very, very dangerous thing to do.
Yeah, when a glider pilot gets thrown through the windshield of his vehicle and ends up 30 yards away, and we say he's one of the lucky ones, then you know that it's really hazardous. In our final moments here with Alex Kershaw, let's talk about sourcing and the number of people that you were able to talk to. That population is disappearing. There are not going to be many more authors such as you who are able to talk to the people who are actually there, but you certainly did the job this time.
Yeah, I mean, I was at the 70th anniversary, just quickly, back in Normandy, in the graveyard at Colville-sur-Mer. There were around about, I think there must have been about 300 American veterans that went over. I think it was around about 300. I just read a couple of days ago that at the 75th anniversary celebrations this year in Normandy, there were less than 30 Americans. So just in the space of 5 years, we've got a tenth of the veterans going back. So that gives you an idea about how fast they're dying out. I mean, they really are disappearing every day so quickly. In 10 years' time, there may not be any more D-Day veterans. Certainly, there may not be any more guys who landed in the first wave.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that makes this book, The First Wave, The D-Day Warriors Who Led the Way to Victory in World War II, such an important resource for us. And it's so wonderful that on this 75th anniversary of D-Day, we're reminded of it by Alex Kershaw. Well, you're talking with us from Savannah, Georgia. That doesn't sound like a Savannah, Georgia accent, but there we go. Alex, thank you so much for being with us this morning.
My pleasure. Thanks a lot.